Hello, Eco 2000 students. Dr. Conway here for Lesson 6 on understanding costs and benefits in environmental economics. This is an especially important topic in environmental economics because I believe, as I've mentioned before, one of the major problems in environmental economics is that a lot of the benefits of projects that try to protect the environment are much more difficult to identify the monetary values of those benefits. I mean, if you're protecting a river basin or you're protecting a particular ecosystem, you can certainly determine the costs that would be involved in trying to address the environmental circumstances of that ecosystem. But the benefits coming back are much more difficult to quantify. And this is why we often say that there's a downward pressure on public goods in the protection of the environment, because most decision making at the government level or at the project level will look at monetized costs and benefits, right? They would think things that have a price tag in the marketplace would get counted quite readily and quite easily. But a lot of the benefits you get from environmental projects, of course, do not come with a market price, right? Birds don't fly past with a price tag on them. Fish don't swim by with a price tag on them. Ecosystem benefits, the joy of nature, don't come with a price that come on it. So environmental economics spends a lot of time looking at ways of monetizing these benefits that otherwise do not have a market price. And the reason we spend so much time on doing that is because if we're going to provide the environment with adequate representation in economic decision making, we need to be able to speak in the language that economic decision making uses to make a decision, which is, of course, monetization. All right. So a lot of the times we're faced with this dilemma of how do we reflect the environment adequately in decision making as to whether to forego certain investments to protect the environment or to make certain investments to protect the environment, when the cost side of the equation can be easily calculated: labor costs, material costs, so on. But the benefit side, some of it will be able to be monetized, like, for example, protecting the ecotourism industry or protecting the inland fishery. You can assign values fairly easy in terms of how many fish would be protected and so on. But there are a lot of environmental benefits that don't come with a readily available price conversion into a market value or a market price. And so we spend a lot of time in environmental economics thinking about ways of legitimately and in a way that can be justified providing a market representation for environmental benefits. Now, many environmental people would argue that that's just crass. I mean, that just feeds into the crass economic decision making. But yes, to an extent, that's in fact true. But in reality, if we want to influence economic decision making with respect to protecting the environment, environmental economists have to come up with ways to better reflect the value of the environment in the kind of decision making we're stuck with today, all right? Which tends to value the monetary side and devalue the other subjective sides that can't be measured in market terms yet, unless environmental economists do something about that, which we do. Now, that having been said, the way we're going to be understanding this cost and benefits discussion is very much linked to your projects, okay? But I want to set out that context because later in another lecture we talk about monetization techniques that environmental economics has developed to provide market value to those items or those benefits of a project, or avoiding a bad project, those benefits that will accrue to the environment, and only then do we get the full integration of the environment and the economy that environmental economists, of course, as you've learned, push for. All right. So on that score, let's take up this question of costs and benefits in our context. All right, and let's go through that. But let's step back and say cost-benefit analysis, as we've learned, is a set of generally accepted methodological rules about how to identify, analyze, and present economic information to decision makers as one basis to make choices between options to address a problem or opportunity. Now, cost-benefit analysis has its value to the environmental community, right? Because it deals with questions of scarcity and opportunity cost. It can help make more sound decisions how to use scarce resources and how to avoid opportunity costs. And that can also be on the side of environment, as well as it can be, work against environment if environmental values are not properly communicated into that cost benefit framework. All right. So it's a two-edged sword here, right? I mean, cost-benefit analysis, the principles of cost-benefit analysis are completely consistent with what an environmental economist would like to see. The practice of implementing cost-benefit analysis, however, often leads to distorted decisions that underrepresent the environment because the environment is not adequately monetized or quantified in the cost-benefit analysis equation, okay? And therefore, if you have a downward pressure on benefits because benefits are not adequately accounted for, then the cost will always look larger than the benefits, and the decision will be to move ahead with what we would consider to be a bad project, or to not do what we would consider to be a good project because costs outweigh benefits, because benefits have not been adequately accounted for. So environmental economists spend a lot of time trying to develop techniques where the environmental benefits that do not have a pre-existing market price can be fully taken into account in these economic decision-making tools, of which cost-benefit analysis is one, because we want to capture the notion that we want to use scarce resources carefully, right? We want to avoid opportunity costs where we can. Okay, so the way we must use these tools as environmental economists is we must find some better ways to interpret the value of environmental conservation, environmental protection into these tools, okay? Because cost-benefit analysis is a way of answering the two prominent questions you've learned about. Is this worth doing? How will we know whether it was worth it when we're done, okay? In other words, is there an opportunity cost, okay? Is it worth doing relative to what other options, right? When we're dealing with scarcity and opportunity costs, we're always saying, is this worth doing relative to other options? Because we have a scarce amount of resources. If we spend it in this area or we consume it in this area, we won't have it for something else. And from an environmental economist point of view, that makes perfect sense, right? I mean, because to the extent that we don't use scarce resources effectively, then we have to further exploit the environment to get more resources, right? And if we continue to use those ineffectively, including in damaging ways towards the environment, then we've dug the hole even deeper, okay? And how will we know whether it was worth doing? And that question is always relative to other opportunity costs, right? Relative to other opportunities. And would those other opportunities have provided us more benefits than the one we chose? And that would constitute an opportunity cost if we made that mistake, right? And again, from an environmental economist's point of view, that's a legitimate question. It's completely consistent with the goal of environmental economists to use scarce resources as effectively as possible, so we do not have to further exploit the environment to generate more resources. Or when we use resources, we use them in an environmentally responsible way, because then, if we don't, then our environmental resources become even more scarce and our opportunities at costs are even greater. So that's the logic where an environmental economist would look at cost benefit and say it's a good tool, but it's only a good tool if we fully account for all of the benefits that ecosystems and the environment provide to society. And that's that environment economy integration that we learned about earlier on, okay? Now, so for environmental economists, just as it is for all economists, right, for economics, I mean, there's a hierarchy of information that we're seeking to get, right? Monetization is best, quantification is second best, and qualification is third best. Is that a crass statement on the state of life, that monetization is best? Well, unfortunately, this is the reality that we live in, right? The value of monetization is that we can compare completely dissimilar objects across space and time, right? Because it's the only unit of measurement we actually have anywhere in the globe where we can compare completely dissimilar objects across space and time. And that fits that scarcity and opportunity cost, right? Should I put my resources into building a building, or should I put my resources into developing a theme park? If I do cost benefit analysis to compare those two investments, I can compare them. Why? Because even if one is in country A and the other is in country C, and country C is a southern hemisphere country and country A is a northern hemisphere country, and they're thousands of miles away, and they're working with different currencies, I can still completely compare their projects. Why? Because I can take both their currencies, tie it back to a singular currency like the US dollar because I know the conversion rate. I know their inflation rate, so I know the dollar value from 50 years ago to what it is today because I can make all those adjustments because all those records are there. That's the only unit of measurement we actually have where we can do that. In addition to that, we have a situation where, let's face it, most major economic decisions and investments are made based on monetary assessments. Okay? That's a reality. Again, that fits scarcity and opportunity cost. So the only question then becomes is how do we make sure that the environment is fully and accurately represented in these kinds of decision-making tools? In a different world, maybe we would make all of our choices based purely on subjectivity and on values and all of that. And that would be great if we did more of that, from my personal opinion. But the reality is most fundamental decisions in society are done based on monetary value. So we seek monetization as the highest level of information that we can use to influence decision making. Quantification is second best. There are many instances where you use quantification instead of monetization, or because you cannot achieve monetization, right? So, for example, let's say we're trying to protect an ecosystem area, right, from an investment. We could say, where we couldn't monetize the value of protecting a particular, say, butterfly species, we would be able to say that if we wipe out that butterfly species, then that will be the 15th butterfly species we've wiped out in the last 10 years. And that can be powerful information quantification, right? I mean, or that we've spent $200 million and that we've helped 30,000 kids as opposed to only 20,000 kids. Pretty powerful argument for one investment option over another, right? So quantification can also be quite powerful, right? Where we can't achieve monetization, or we can't achieve monetization that your audience will understand because it was too technical to achieve monetization of the butterfly, right? So you also have to communicate in a language that people will understand and accept as credible, right? And that can be difficult in the area of the environment. So environmental economists spend a lot of time looking at that. Action on climate change really didn't start to happen until we had the Stern report, large reports that monetized the cost to the environment, monetized the cost to public health if we did nothing on climate change. It wasn't, climate change didn't start getting traction until our environmental economists developed methodologies that could accurately portray the monetary implications of inaction, all right? And so it's a very powerful tool. And where you can't monetize or where you can't quantify, you need to, you can still qualify. So even very sophisticated environmental economics reports, forecasting reports like on climate change and others, will still use qualification for those areas where you're trying to reveal the implications, moral or otherwise, of an action. And so you qualify, we can't do this for the following reasons. It would just be completely inconsistent with our belief system and all of that. That's perfectly credible. But you can also use it for things like, tertiary studies, like, doing green buildings attracts higher levels of top-end graduates. We can quantify that. And we can even monetize it, but really, qualification would also be effective in that case. Say if you interviewed some young candidates or you did a survey or whatever, you can develop qualification arguments for it, okay? But this is a hierarchy of information. Monetization is best, quantification is second best, qualification is third best. Okay, qualification, of course, is the written word, right? Quantification is numerics, right? Monetization is exactly what it says, translating the value of things into monetary value, a price. Okay, so that's what cost-benefit analysis tries to do when it looks at the costs and benefits of all projects, right, in the area of the environment. And the same thing applies to your projects, right? But before you can determine costs and benefits of any investment, policy action, or intervention of a different kind, the researcher must first grasp who and or what is involved or will be impacted. And that's the scope of your project, right? That's the scope I'm talking to you about. What is the scope of your project? So when I tell you to scope the areas of the building that you're going to be working with on interior design, what does that do? Okay, well, immediately, I'm not interested. The scope is necessary. But the scope I quickly move past. Okay, is that their scope? Because now the scope tells me, okay, who's involved? What services do they get from it? Okay? how are they impacted by it? Okay. For example, if I was doing a study on the effects of junk food in elementary schools, and my scope was specifically that, I'm looking at the impacts of junk food in elementary schools on child's health, child's weight, child's learning ability, and all of that. Then the scope becomes very clear. Who's impacted by that scope? Well, obviously the children, but also the teachers, but also the people that sell the junk food to the school. Right? They also the health sector. So as soon as you give me a scope like that, I say, okay, who's all going to be impacted by this scope? Who's going to be impacted by it? And I can quickly begin to say, okay, these are the stakeholders involved. And so the stakeholders involved will all have a cost and benefit tag on them in terms of what it is that it will cost them for this changed proposal that I'm suggesting, this policy alternative or this investment that I'm considering, and what benefits will they accrue out of it? Okay. But it gets more complex in complex environmental economics projects, right? Where there are direct and or indirect, intended and or unintended costs and benefits. Okay. Now you won't have a lot of those because your project is relatively discrete. But if you're doing, say, a large development project in a greenfield, you would have lots of costs and benefits, both direct and indirect. Like, let's say we're building a dam, and we're brought in as environmental economists to look at the implications of building this dam. The question would, okay, what area will the dam cover? I mean, what will the artificial lake cover? What communities will be impacted? So once we determine what the scope is, we can begin to itemize, okay, the costs and benefits for that project. All right. And so that's why we need to focus on the scope, and we need to realize that in any project, any investment, there are both direct and indirect costs and benefits, both intended and unintended costs and benefits. And any good project manager tries to anticipate all of those things. Of course, anything that's unintended, you don't know until the project goes on, but you try to anticipate some of those unintended impacts right early on in the project so that you don't get hammered later on. You won't be always right in terms of anticipating unintended impacts, because a lot of the unintended impacts won't be realized until the project is in effect or the investment is in effect. But any good project manager will always try to anticipate the unintended direct and indirect impacts, okay? As well as, of course, any project manager must know the intended or the objectives of an investment, the intended costs and benefits, direct and indirect. Okay, so, and that's why, when you're doing building projects, you recognize that you can't anticipate all unintended costs. And so you budget a contingency, right, in any major development project, whether that be building a whole structure or an interior design project or whatever. I mean, it's typical for builders, for example, of buildings to anticipate a 10 to 15% contingency, because they know they can't anticipate all the things that will go around. Their experience tells them that some things will go wrong, but they don't know the scale for this particular project, so they build in a contingency, okay? And if the project is much more complex, right, unusually complex relative to their previous experience, a smart project manager may build in some additional contingency, may go 18% on contingency, or maybe even 20% on contingency if the project is especially complex, right? Because they can anticipate some of the unintended costs and benefits because they have previous project experience. So they can say, yeah, these guys say they'll be there by such and such a time, but I know that we're going to lose probably 5 days on some of the transition between some of the trades and stuff. So I'm going to build that rate into my budget now. But then in addition to that, there might be some unforeseen things, so I'm building in a 10 to 15% contingency that'll be in the budget line just as contingency for when things go wrong, because we know they will go wrong, so we just hope that we can keep it under the 10 to 15% contingency. All right, so good project managers are always anticipating all costs, all benefits, direct and indirect, intended and unintended. All right. Now this table here is a very simple way of portraying that. Okay, so you see down the left column is intended costs, intended benefits, unintended costs, and unintended benefits, right? But then across you've got direct costs and benefits, the costs, intended benefits, and so on. You fill out that matrix, okay, as appropriate for the cell. And that's the way of categorizing it. When I do cost benefit projects, believe it or not, that's what I do. I just have this table on my screen, and I start to look, and I start to jot into the cells things that I think are going to be direct costs and direct benefits, and things that I think are going to be indirect costs and indirect benefits. And I lay them out, and so I can actually see. And if the project is very complicated, it's a big table, but then I can begin to see, okay, what do I have to manage in this project? What factors do I need to incorporate into my cost benefit analysis? Which of these can I monetize? Which of these can I only quantify? Which of these can I only qualify? All right, and that you lay out that conceptual framework. So if you're doing a large building and you're going to be doing something in the green build, if you're using a certification program, the certification program like LEED and it's already done this for you, right? They've already laid out the criteria. But if you're doing a completely new project, for example, if we were doing a cost benefit analysis on a new dam in Northern Ontario, this is literally how I would start. I would say, okay, this is the plan that the government has for the dam. This is the square kilometers that the dam is going to impact. These are the villages that are in the area. These are the economic activities in the area, and so on. And then literally I would just begin to fill out this matrix, and it may end up being 7 pages long. But that's then I begin to get the lay of the land as to what needs to be accounted for in the cost benefit analysis. Okay, which of these can I monetize? Which of these can I quantify? Which of these can I qualify? And each cell may have several factors in it. For example, you're building a dam, direct costs, right? Intended costs, right? Intended costs would be obviously the materials and the labor needed to build the dam, but there would also be other intended costs, right? Perfectly intended costs. You might have to move a village. Okay, that would be an intended cost because you can't build the dam and drown everybody. So if you're committing to building this thing, it becomes an intended cost. It is an intended cost. So it needs to be factored into the construction, right? And then the intended benefits, would obviously be related to power and be related to economic activity of the surrounding area for, better schools, better education, better healthcare, better transportation networks to the community because people have to get in there to build the dam, service the dam, so they have to build roads. So there would be all kinds of benefits as well, right? And from an economic point of view, environmental point of view, there would be costs. There would be elevations of mercury contamination in the environment, which happens when dams are built. There would be, you get the idea. And you start to fill that complex a project out in a matrix like this, and the matrix can easily be 6 spreadsheets long. Easily. Okay? Now, when you're doing your projects, of course, we would need to, that's going to be smaller. For you do green, you're going to be focusing on green benefits that are somewhat more discrete because you're dealing with a smaller question, right? But you're still going to be looking at, better working environment, better productivity, better air quality, fewer sick days, maybe stakeholder brand recognition for being a green company, all of those things. So you start laying all that out in your matrix. And you begin to say, once you have that matrix filled out, you can say, okay, we can monetize this because there's been studies that have shown the benefits, and we can pull that data and apply it to our study as long as we adjust it to appropriate scale for our study. We can quantify this, right? We have survey data that says that young employees want to go to a green company at 75% rate as opposed to 25% to say they don't care. So we quantify, and then we qualify. We might not have data, but we should still qualify the benefits as we see them because logic and reason does matter, right? Even when you don't have numbers, logic and reason does matter. Logic and reason does still convince people of things, okay? So, that in table 1 would be quite large when a researcher is considering a substantial investment or intervention of a different kind, right? I mean, if we go back to that table, we would see that, a traditional economist would look at that and what that table would look like in cost and benefits, right? It would be all of those things that are quite readily in a neoclassical way monetized. They have a market price. So they would put in labor costs, material costs, time delay, financing costs, and all of that. It's a typical thing that economists do. And then benefits, they would focus primarily on rate of return, energy savings, these kinds of things, right? An environmental economist would consider those things, but an environmental economist would need to go further because we would need to value the environmental benefits that do not have a pre-existing market price, right? And this is the challenge that environmental economists spend a lot of time on, representing those values that do not currently have a market price. So this table filled out by a neoclassical economist or a typical microeconomist would look similar to an environmental economist, but an environmental economist would be adding much more in terms of trying to reflect the costs and benefits related to ecosystem values, okay? And each cell in the table might have several factors in it that become study variables, right? And everybody knows what a variable is, right? A variable is a factor that you're measuring, and the scores on that factor can vary. Therefore, we call it a variable. For example, the variable of age varies, right? I mean, if we did a survey of our class, right? It would vary. There would be a big cluster around your age group, right? And then I would be a big outlier, right? Older, right? And there might be some younger people in the class. But, it's measuring the same factor, which is age. But because our ages differ, there's variance on that factor. Therefore, we call it a variable, right? So that's what we mean by variable. And that's what you're always doing in cost-benefit analysis, right? You're identifying your scope. Then you're identifying all of the factors that need to be measured, and you're converting those into variables, right? Because once you measure the factor, they vary. So, if costs of materials can vary depending upon the supplier, right? But when we're measuring a cost and benefit, we're dealing with variables, all right? Because things can vary quite a bit, right? So you might find that some factors will be much more variable than other factors depending upon the circumstances and the type of study you're doing. So everybody should understand the basic concept of a variable, which is a factor that you want to measure because it defines the scope of your project, all right? And you need to measure those variables for your baseline, right? Remember, all economic analysis compares with a baseline. So if you're arguing that, building out this area will cost so much for this item, so much for that item, so much for labor, so much for this, so much for that, then that has to be done for the baseline, which in your case is off-the-shelf building code only. And then then the same variables for your green design would have to be factored into it, right? Because you need to compare the baseline variables with the variables for the green design, right? Or factors, right? So you got to put flooring down. Well, in the standard build, it's carpeting, and in your build, it's bamboo. Let's say, okay. So those factors, and they have variable prices. All right, and you're comparing those two things. Okay. So you cannot do a cost-benefit analysis. First, you understand the way things are now for all your study variables in the matrix. That is your baseline. So if you're building out an area, what are all the factors you need? Well, you need flooring, you need walling, you need lighting, you need whatever. All of those become factors that you measure. You measure them for your baseline, and then the same factors get measured for your green design. And those are direct costs, okay? And then those can be compared. But it's only relevant to compare them when we also then look at the benefits of each model and say, do the benefits exceed the costs in each model? The baseline and the green model, okay? And do the benefits in the green model justify the additional cost of building out green? That's essentially, in a bottom line, what your project is about, okay? So measuring baseline costs, working out the cost side of the cost-benefit analysis requires careful attention to what cost information is relevant, what's available, and how it can be interpreted and used, right? In some cases, costs are very simple. I know what it costs me per square foot to buy this carpet. It's not particularly rocket science, right? But labor costs may be quite variable. You can. I personally, when I do construction, any of kind of construction, I'll send out for at least 5 bids, because I have seen cases where the variability can be 50-60% in cost. All right. Now, I'm not expecting you to get into that level of detail, but I mean, you have to realize that measuring the baseline cost is not as simple as kind of, it's easy. I mean, we're going to need carpet, we're going to need nails, we're going to need laborers, all of that has to be budgeted, right? but it has to be budgeted correctly, because there will be variability of costs in some areas. All right. So it can seem like a straightforward task, but a comprehensive cost analysis can be quite complex and demanding and time consuming if you have to go out to 5 bids on things and so on, right? So, it can be quite an exercise, and that's the reason that budgeting is a valuable workplace skill in and of itself. I mean, if you're working in your area, having good budgeting skills is going to be critical to your success, because that's where people will make decisions, and that's where, if you come in to give a proposal to an investor, for example, you're not going to be convincing just the CEOs or just the president or just the head of a division. That person's going to be running those numbers by their accounting or controller department, right? So, I mean, budgeting becomes a very, very important consideration for the success in your field, all right? Simple example scenario, right? The baseline build in this sector typically selects carpets. We are going with bamboo. That is a cost upgrade. But on the benefit side, we have better aesthetics, improvement to air quality, ease of maintenance, longevity, providing additional benefits to a buyer or renter, etc., etc., etc. So our challenge is to reflect the fact that, yes, additional cost, but much more additional benefits. Okay, so the standard build has this cost and these kind of typical benefits. The green build might have a greater cost, but the benefits, the difference between the benefits of the green build and the benefits of the typical build are even greater than the cost escalation. And that's what we're trying to validate. All right. Now, we don't always end up that way, and it's not always the only basis for a decision to be taken, but that's the principle, right? Where we want any alternative method to provide more benefits relative to the additional cost required, right? And so therefore budgeting becomes very important, and capturing all the benefits becomes very important. So, all of the costs of the green build are compared with your baseline, which is the standard build. All of the benefits of the green build are compared with the standard build's benefit to conclude that, yes, you spent 7% more to build it out this way, but you got 15% more in benefits. Okay? Now, I'm not asking you to do the benefits of the standard build in your case. Normally, we would be required to do that in some projects, but in this one, I'm not, because benefits of the standard build are commonly known. What we want to look for is the relationship between the costs of the green build and the costs of the standard build and the benefits of the green build. Okay, and we read in the benefits of the standard build. Okay. A key cost question is, what are the costs and the current way of doing business, and how will those costs compare with the proposed new way of doing business? That's what we're looking for, all right? Cost might be as obvious as the financial outlay for some higher grade building materials, or as subtle as the extra time it takes a supervisor to explain new procedures to staff members, right? It depends how you're going to define cost, but all of these, if you're doing a real project, all of these costs, both direct and indirect, intended and unintended, have to be anticipated, or you have to do your best to anticipate them whenever you're doing a large project, right? I mean, any project that's going to be worth, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, any good project manager is going to spend a lot of time on budgeting, anticipating these risks, right? Anticipating these costs. And figuring out where those costs, can be mitigated, where cost overruns can be mitigated, strategies for mitigating cost overruns, strategies for potentially saving on budget line items. A good project manager will have systems for thinking about all these things before they present a proposal on how the project should proceed, right? Define benefits, right? Estimate a list of the expected benefits of developing the new way of doing business, right? Typical benefit categories include faster, better, cheaper, over the long haul, etc., right? But also from our perspective in the green build, it's other things like work environment, productivity. Any data you can get on that kind of stuff becomes very important if you're trying to convince a client to do a new build. Staff recruitment, staff retention, stakeholder recognition, brand recognition in the community, advertising potential. All of these things can come to fruition. Most of which you will not be able to monetize in your project because you don't have the time and the expertise, but you should at least flag them qualitatively or quantitatively if there are other survey studies or whatever that have shown that, right? So just do basic research and find out what you can find. If we do this, what is LEED saying is the benefits? What is Energy Star saying are the benefits? What is, whatever technique or criteria you're using or certification you're using, what are they saying are the benefits, and then build out from there, okay? And the analysis would typically include a statement of how each benefit will be measured to see if it has been achieved. Again, if you're an environmental economist doing a big project for government, the government would want to see how far you can push monetization. Yeah, they want to, right? Particularly politicians. They want to be able to point to monetary benefits, right? I mean, that's how they communicate with the citizenry, right? I mean, that's the one element that they can assume the citizenry will understand, okay? So they want that language. In your case, we won't be able to monetize a bunch of these things, but I want you to be able to identify them and understand them, okay? Or find secondary research that points to them, okay? Or that at least implies that they exist, all right? And so, again, monetization where you can, quantification where you can't monetize, qualification where you can't do either of the first two, all right? Cost-benefit framework for you would be typical, right? Cost of the current way of doing business. This is your baseline. Personnel, equipment, supplies, utility, contractual services, facility construction, failure to compete. All of these kind of things would come into play. Some of them will be applicable to your project. Some of them will not be, all right? But it just gives you a simple matrix for thinking about that. So when you're laying out your budget for your standard build, this is the kind of thing that I want to see in budgeting, right? And what is the direct cost? And is there an indirect cost, right? Is there something? In your cases, there won't be much, right? So I wouldn't spend too much time on that. I lay this out for you because in a typical cost-benefit analysis done by environmental economists, we would be looking at those indirect costs, right? We would be looking at, what it costs us to clear this land in terms of lost habitat, environment, and these kinds of things, right? We would be. But in your case, you're primarily going to be dealing with direct costs, okay? So you're going to be filling out the first of those columns, okay, in terms of establishing your baseline. Costs of setting up the new way of doing business. Again, you will be focusing primarily on direct costs. The indirect costs is something in the, we would be considering in the broader environmental economics context, all right? And then benefits of the suggested new way of doing business, direct benefits and indirect benefits. Here I would expect you to talk to me about indirect benefits of the new way of doing business, all right? So, I want you to think about some of the benefits that would come, right? Lower life cycle maintenance costs, enhanced productivity, lower cost of operation, more efficient energy use, improved health results, better environment. And these are just examples, right? These are just example tables, okay? There may be other factors that you would add. But in this table, I would expect you would be talking about direct benefits and indirect benefits to the extent you can. Indirect benefits would be, say, a brand, or an indirect benefit to the company's marketing strategy, or an indirect benefit to the company's recruiting strategy. These are the types of things that would come into play. All right. On that, I'll wrap it up. We can talk about this again on our next Zoom call. But this is important because we have the midterm exam coming up, and some of these things will certainly be on it. All right. So on that score, I'll let you go. Have a good week, gang, and talk to you again soon. Bye-bye now.